Cale Vance had never seen so much green in his entire life. The Galactic Unity Academy floated in the stars like a jewel made of light and glass and impossible dreams. And everywhere he looked there were plants and water fountains and open spaces that seemed to waste oxygen just because they could. On Mars, oxygen was precious, and every breath was a gift you earned through hard work and suffering. Here, the rich children of the galaxy breathed deep without thinking, and Cale felt like a stranger in a world that was never meant for someone like him. He walked through the gleaming corridors with his worn bag over his shoulder, his clothes clean but old, his boots patched in 3 places where the Martian dust had eaten through the leather. The other students moved around him like water flowing past a stone, their expensive clothes and perfect skin, and easy laughter making him feel smaller with every step. He was 17 years old, and he was the first human from the Martian colonies to ever attend this academy, a scholarship student plucked from the red dust and dropped into a world of privilege he did not understand. His mother would have been proud if she had lived long enough to see this day. But she had died in a mine collapse when Cale was 12, her hand growing cold in his, while rescue teams dug through the rubble for 6 hours. And he had learned on that day that the universe did not care about fairness or dreams or the hopes of a boy from the dust. The classroom was large and filled with students from a dozen different species, their faces strange and beautiful, and sometimes frightening to look upon. Cale found a seat in the back corner where he could watch everyone without being watched himself, a habit he had learned in the mining camps, where being noticed often meant being targeted. The instructor was a tall being with silver skin and 4 arms, and she spoke with a voice that hummed like music as she began the lesson on galactic history. Cale listened carefully because knowledge was the one thing no one could take from him, and he had fought too hard for this chance to waste it on daydreaming. The lesson turned to the early expansion period of humanity, those desperate years when humans had crawled across their solar system without faster-than-light travel, building colonies on hostile worlds through sheer stubborn refusal to die. The instructor spoke of these times with a tone that made Cale's jaw tighten, words like primitive and struggling and desperate falling from her lips like gentle insults, wrapped in academic language. And then a voice cut through the classroom like a knife made of silk and poison. "How fascinating that humans managed to survive at all," the voice said, sweet and sharp at the same time, living in tin cans and breathing recycled air while the rest of us were building civilizations among the stars. Cale looked up and saw her for the first time. Lyrie Velshin was beautiful in a way that hurt to look at, her skin pale blue and luminous, her eyes like pools of liquid silver, her hair flowing like captured starlight around a face that had never known hardship or hunger or fear. She was Althean, one of the elder races, telepathic and powerful and convinced of their own superiority in ways that went deeper than mere arrogance. She was looking directly at Cale with a smile that was not kind. "You there," she said, and every eye in the classroom turned to follow her gaze. "You are from Mars, yes. One of those colony worlds where humans scratched in the dirt like animals." Cale said nothing because he had learned long ago that words were weapons, and silence was a shield. "Tell me," Lyrie continued, her voice dripping with false curiosity, "how does it feel knowing your grandparents lived in pressurized boxes, counting every breath, while my people were composing symphonies in the light of neutron stars? How does it feel to come from such humble and pathetic beginnings?" Laughter rippled through the classroom, soft and cruel, and even the instructor smiled as if this was merely clever wit rather than calculated cruelty. Cale felt his fists clench beneath his desk, felt the anger rise in his chest like a familiar fire, but he kept his face still and his eyes steady. He had been mocked before by people far more dangerous than a spoiled princess, who had never known a moment of real suffering. He had buried friends in the red dust of Mars, had held his dying mother while the oxygen ran out, had worked the mines alongside men 3 times his age just to earn enough to eat. This girl with her perfect skin and easy life knew nothing of the world that had shaped him, and her words were like pebbles thrown against a mountain. They could not hurt him because he had already survived things that would break her into pieces. So he simply looked at her with eyes that had seen too much, and he said nothing at all. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight, and something flickered across Larry's face, a shadow of uncertainty that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Nothing to say?" she asked, her smile returning. "I suppose there is not much to say when your entire species is still learning to walk among the stars." The instructor cleared her throat and returned to the lesson, and the moment passed like a cloud moving across the sun. Cale turned his attention back to his notes, his hands steady even as his heart pounded with controlled fury. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He would learn everything this academy had to teach him, and then he would return to Mars and build something better for his people. And these laughing children of privilege would never understand what it meant to earn every single thing you had. The lesson continued for another 20 minutes, and Cale wrote down every word because knowledge was power, and he intended to claim as much of it as he could. And then the universe decided to remind everyone in that classroom what it really meant to survive. The alarms came first, a screaming wail that cut through the air like a physical force, red lights flashing across every surface as the station shuddered beneath their feet. The instructor stopped mid-sentence, her silver face going pale with shock. An announcement blared through speakers that crackled with interference, a voice tight with barely controlled panic. Code Omega declared for all sectors, hull breach detected in Sector 7, atmospheric containment failing across multiple zones, all students and staff shelter in place immediately. This is not a drill. The gravity fluctuated wildly, sending students tumbling from their seats, screams filling the air as the lights flickered and died and came back dimmer than before. Cale was already on his feet, his body moving on instincts carved into him by years of surviving on a world that tried to kill him every single day. He saw the emergency bulkheads at the classroom doors slam shut with a grinding mechanical roar, trapping them inside. He felt the temperature begin to drop as the environmental systems failed. He heard the hiss of escaping air from somewhere behind the walls. And as the privileged children of the galaxy began to scream and cry and claw at each other in their terror, Cale Vance took a deep breath of the thinning air and felt something cold and calm settle into his bones. This was not new to him. On Mars, this was just another day. He looked across the room at Lyrie Velshon, watched her collapse to her knees with her hands pressed against her temples, overwhelmed by the psychic weight of everyone's fear. And despite everything she had said to him, despite the cruelty and the laughter and the casual dismissal of everything his people had suffered, Cale felt no satisfaction in her terror. He felt only the steady pulse of purpose that had carried him through every dark moment of his life. Someone had to save these people. And there was no one else. The classroom had become a cage of terror and failing systems, and Cale watched his classmates fall apart like structures built on sand. The Althian students were the worst, their bodies crumpling as their telepathic minds were overwhelmed by the flood of fear pouring from everyone around them. The other species were not much better, screaming and crying and clawing at the sealed doors as if panic alone could save them. The instructor had frozen completely, her 4 arms hanging limp at her sides, her silver eyes wide and empty as her mind simply refused to process what was happening. Cale had seen this before in the mines, strong men and women shutting down when disaster struck because their brains could not handle the reality of imminent death. On Mars, those people died first. He did not intend to let that happen here. "Everyone shut up and listen to me," Cale said, and his voice cut through the chaos like a blade through cloth. It was not loud, but it carried a weight of authority that made heads turn and mouths close. Kale moved to the center of the room, his eyes scanning every corner, his mind calculating with the cold precision of someone who had done this before. The room was approximately 40 meters square with ceilings about 4 meters high, which meant roughly 640 cubic meters of air. There were 23 people in the room, including himself. At normal breathing rates with rising panic increasing oxygen consumption, they had maybe 30 minutes before the air became too thin to sustain most species. But Kale could already hear the hiss of escaping atmosphere through the walls, which meant they had less time than that. "You," he pointed at a tall, insected student whose compound eyes were flickering with fear. "And you," he pointed at a reptilian boy who was hyperventilating. "Start pulling the cushions off every chair and stack them against that wall where the hissing sound is coming from." They stared at him like he had spoken in a foreign language. "Now," Kale barked, and they scrambled to obey because in moments of crisis, people desperately wanted someone to tell them what to do. Kale turned to the instructor who was still standing frozen, gently took her arm, and guided her to a seat in the corner where she would not be in the way. Then he moved to the supply closet at the back of the room and began pulling out everything that might be useful. There was emergency sealant tape meant for minor repairs, and Kale grabbed all 6 rolls. There was a small toolkit with basic instruments, and he shoved it into his pocket. There was a fire suppression blanket made of heat-resistant material, and he knew exactly what to do with it. He worked fast because every second mattered, his hands steady even as the temperature continued to drop, and his breath began to fog in the air. The other students watched him with wide eyes, their panic slowly shifting to something like desperate hope as they saw someone moving with purpose, instead of fear. Kale directed 2 more students to help him press the cushions tight against the wall where the air leak was worst. Then he used the sealant tape to secure them in place. It was not a perfect solution, but it would slow the loss of atmosphere. He found the air circulation vent in the ceiling and climbed up on a desk to examine it, his fingers probing the mechanisms with the expertise of someone who had repaired similar systems 100 times. "What are you doing?" someone asked in a trembling voice, and Kale recognized it as Lyrie even though she sounded nothing like the confident girl who had mocked him minutes ago. "The emergency oxygen reserves should be in a compartment connected to this vent," Kale said without looking at her. "Every classroom has them, but they do not deploy automatically if the main computer is down." He found the manual release and pulled it, and there was a hiss as bottled oxygen began flowing into the room, buying them precious extra time. Lyrie had crawled closer, her blue skin now pale and her silver eyes wet with tears she was too proud to let fall. Her hands were shaking, and her breath came in short gasps that had nothing to do with the thin air. Kale jumped down from the desk and crouched beside her, and when he spoke his voice was different now, calm and steady like a rock in a storm. "Look at me," he said, and she did. "You are having a panic attack because you are feeling everyone else's fear through your telepathy, yes?" She nodded, her jaw clenched tight against the scream that wanted to escape. "Then stop reaching out," Kale said simply. "Pull your mind back inside yourself like closing a door. Focus only on my voice, only on my words. Can you do that?" "I do not know how," she whispered. "I have never felt anything like this. There is so much fear, so much terror, I cannot." "Yes, you can," Kale said firmly. "On Mars we have something called the quiet mind, something miners use when they are trapped and waiting for rescue. You focus on one thing and one thing only. You count your heartbeats. You feel the rhythm of your own blood. You let everything else fade away until there is only you in the darkness. Can you try that for me?" Lyrie closed her eyes, and her face twisted with effort as she tried to follow his instructions. Kale watched her breathing slowly steady, watched the trembling in her hands begin to fade, watched her find something like peace in the chaos around them. "Good," he said softly. Keep doing that. Do not stop until I tell you it is safe." He stood and turned to face the rest of the room, his classmates who had mocked him and ignored him and treated him like something less than themselves. They looked at him now with different eyes. "The emergency bulkheads are sealed because the station's computer thinks this sector is completely compromised," Kale announced. "But there is a manual override panel behind that wall covering, and I am going to open it." He moved to the wall he had indicated and began prying off the decorative panel with tools from the kit, revealing the complex mechanism beneath. The other students gathered behind him, no longer screaming, no longer panicking, simply watching the Martian boy work with hands that did not shake and eyes that did not waver. "How do you know all of this?" the insectoid student asked quietly. Kale did not pause in his work as he answered. "Because where I come from, knowing this is the difference between living and dying. We do not have perfect environmental systems or automatic safety measures or rescue teams that arrive in minutes. We have ourselves and what we know and nothing else." The manual override was more complex than the ones on Mars, designed for species with more fingers and different tools. But Kale adapted and improvised and refused to let the machine defeat him. His fingers were growing numb from the cold, and the oxygen level was dropping despite the emergency reserves, and he could feel the edges of his vision starting to darken. But he kept working because that was what his people did, what his mother had done in the mine shaft until her very last breath, what every Martian learned before they could walk. You never stopped fighting. You never gave up. You survived. There was a click and a grinding noise, and then the bulkhead began to slowly rise, revealing the corridor beyond. But what Kale saw on the other side made his heart sink. The corridor was filled with smoke and fire and debris. The ceiling collapsed in several places, the floor buckled and broken, and the air out there was even worse than inside the classroom. There was no safe path to rescue. There was only a gauntlet of destruction that would test every limit of what a human body could endure. Kale turned back to face his classmates, saw the hope in their eyes flicker and die as they realized what lay ahead. "I am not going to lie to you," he said quietly. "That corridor is dangerous and some of you may not make it, but if we stay here we will all die when the oxygen runs out. So we go forward, we stay together, and we do not stop moving no matter what we see or hear or feel." He paused and looked at each of them in turn, these children of privilege who had never known true hardship. "Stay close to me," Kale said, "and do exactly what I tell you." Then he turned and walked into the fire, and one by one they followed the dust boy from Mars into the burning heart of the station. The corridor was a nightmare made real, filled with fire and smoke, and the groaning sounds of a station tearing itself apart. Kale moved through it like he was walking through a familiar dream, his body low to avoid the worst of the smoke, his eyes constantly scanning for danger, his mind calculating every step before he took it. Behind him came the others, a terrified chain of students from a dozen different worlds, their hands gripping each other's arms or clothes or anything they could hold on to. Kale had torn strips from the fire suppression blanket and distributed them as makeshift breathing filters, a trick he had learned when a chemical fire broke out in the mining tunnels when he was 14. It was not perfect, but it would help keep the worst of the toxic fumes out of their lungs. A support beam groaned above them, and Kale threw up his hand to stop the line, watching as a section of ceiling collapsed just meters ahead with a thunderous crash. Sparks flew everywhere and the heat washed over them like a physical wave, but Kale did not flinch. He simply waited for the debris to settle, and then found a new path around the obstruction, guiding the others through gaps that seemed too small and over wreckage that shifted dangerously beneath their feet. One of the Althian boys stumbled and fell, his ankle twisted beneath him, and he cried out in pain as he hit the floor. Without hesitation, Kale turned back and lifted the boy onto his back, carrying him like he weighed nothing even though the Althean was taller than Kale by a full head. "Keep moving," Kale commanded, and they kept moving. The fire suppression systems had failed in this section, and flames crawled along the walls like living things, hungry and reaching for anything that would burn. Kale could feel his skin blistering from the heat, but he pushed the pain away to a distant corner of his mind where it could not distract him. Pain was just information. His mother had taught him that. It tells you something is wrong, but it does not have to control you. You control it. They passed a window that looked out into the void of space, and through the smoke Kale could see debris floating outside, pieces of the station torn away by whatever catastrophe had struck. He wondered briefly what had caused this disaster, but then pushed the thought aside because it did not matter now. Only survival mattered. Lyrie was moving close behind him, her breath ragged through the makeshift filter, her silver eyes fixed on his back like he was a lighthouse in a storm. She had managed to partially shield her mind from the psychic noise around her, but she could not block it completely, and fragments of emotion kept leaking through her defenses. What surprised her was what she sensed from Kale. She had expected fear. Everyone felt fear in moments like this. She had expected anger, especially toward her and the others who had treated him so cruelly. But what she found in his mind was something entirely different. There was a deep calm at the center of him, a stillness that seemed impossible in the midst of such chaos. There was focus so sharp it was almost painful to touch, every thought bent toward a single purpose, every decision weighed and measured in fractions of a second. And beneath it all there was something that made Lyrie's heart clench in a way she did not understand. Compassion. Not for himself but for them, for the frightened student stumbling through the smoke behind him, for the injured boy on his back, for her. He was saving people who had mocked him and belittled him and treated him like dirt beneath their feet, and he was doing it without a single thought of revenge or resentment. This is who he is, Lyrie realized with sudden clarity. This is what humans are. They reached a junction where two corridors met and Kale paused, his head tilting as he listened to sounds that no one else could hear. "The left path is blocked," he announced. "I can hear structural failure about 50 meters down. We go right." No one questioned him because no one else had any idea where to go, and so they followed the dust boy deeper into the burning station. What none of them knew was that a small security drone had activated in the junction they just passed through, its emergency protocols kicking in as it detected life signs moving through a compromised area. The drone began following them at a safe distance, its cameras recording everything, its transmitter broadcasting to the station's emergency network. And because the station's main communications had automatically switched to emergency broadcast mode, that feed was being picked up by receivers far beyond the station itself. On the news networks of 36 worlds, programming was interrupted by emergency alerts. In homes and offices and ships across the sector, people stopped what they were doing to watch. And what they saw was a teenage human boy carrying a wounded alien on his back while leading a group of terrified students through a corridor filled with fire. They saw him pause to help a fallen student back to her feet, his burned hands gentle despite the obvious pain. They saw him shield others with his own body when a section of wall exploded outward in a shower of sparks. They saw him press forward through conditions that should have killed him 10 times over, his face set with determination that seemed almost inhuman in its intensity. Commentators fell silent because there were no words for what they were witnessing. Military analysts leaned forward in their chairs, studying his movements with professional interest. Parents held their children close and wondered how a boy so young could carry such weight. And across the galaxy, billions of beings watched a human do what humans had always done since they first crawled out of the mud of their violent little world. Survive. Endure. Refuse to die. Cale knew nothing of the audience watching him as he reached a section of corridor where the floor had partially collapsed, revealing a drop of several meters to the level below. The gap was too wide to jump, especially while carrying the injured boy. But on the other side, he could see an intact emergency pod bay, their best chance of survival if they could just reach it. "I need something to bridge this gap," Cale said, and the students looked around desperately for anything that might help. The insectoid student pointed to a metal support beam that had fallen from the ceiling, partially embedded in the wall nearby. It was heavy, probably too heavy for any of them to lift, but Cale handed the injured boy to two other students and approached the beam. He gripped it with his burned hands, ignoring the screaming protest of his damaged nerves, and began to pull. The beam did not move at first, but Cale did not stop. He planted his feet and pulled harder, his muscles straining beneath his worn clothes, his teeth clenched against the pain. On Mars, they said that humans were weak compared to other species, smaller and softer and less equipped for the harsh universe beyond their homeworld. But on Mars, they also knew something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. Humans were not built to be the strongest or the fastest or the toughest. Humans were built to endure, to push past limits that would break other species, to keep going when every rational part of their biology said stop. The beam groaned and shifted, then came free from the wall in a shower of sparks and dust. Cale dragged it to the gap in the floor and positioned it as a bridge, his arms shaking with exhaustion but his will unbroken. "One at a time," he ordered, "move carefully and do not look down." They crossed one by one, some crawling on hands and knees, others walking with arms stretched out for balance. Cale went last, carrying the injured boy again, his feet steady on the narrow beam despite everything his body had endured. When they reached the other side and the emergency pod bay door stood before them, a ragged cheer went up from the group. But Cale silenced them with a look. "We are not safe yet," he said quietly. "We have to get these pods launched and away from the station before the main reactor goes critical, which based on what I have seen could be any minute now, so move." He began directing them to the pods, sorting them into groups based on the pod capacity, making sure the injured were loaded first. And when the last of his classmates was safely inside a pod, Cale finally allowed himself to feel the weight of what he had done. His legs gave out and he collapsed against the wall, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated damage of burns and smoke inhalation and oxygen deprivation and physical strain beyond anything he had ever experienced. But even as darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, he watched the pods launch one by one, carrying 17 students to safety. 17 lives saved. And somewhere deep in his fatting consciousness, Cale heard his mother's voice, soft and warm and proud. "Well done, my son. Well done." Cale woke in a room made of light and soft humming sounds, and the gentle beeping of machines he did not recognize. The ceiling above him was white and curved like the inside of an egg, and the air smelled clean in a way that made his throat ache with unfamiliarity. He tried to sit up, but his body refused to obey, every muscle screaming in protest, and he fell back against pillows that were softer than anything he had ever felt before. A face appeared above him, a medical technician with gentle hands and kind eyes, who smiled and said something he could not quite process through the fog in his mind. "The others," Cale managed to croak, his voice raw and broken, "did everyone make it?" The technician's smile grew wider and she nodded, and Cale felt something release in his chest that he had not even realized he was holding. 17 students had entered those escape pods. 17 students had been rescued by the emergency response ships. No one had died. Cale closed his eyes and let himself drift back into darkness, his duty finally complete. When he woke again, he was more aware of his surroundings and the extent of what had happened to him. His hands were wrapped in healing bandages that glowed with soft blue light. repairing the burns he had suffered when he gripped the hot metal beam. His ribs were immobilized by some kind of field that tingled against his skin, several of them cracked from the strain of carrying the injured boy. His lungs had been flushed and treated for the smoke damage, and every breath felt new and strange and precious. But he was alive. He had survived. On Mars, that was always the only thing that truly mattered. A doctor came to see him, a tall being with 4 eyes and a voice like rustling leaves, who explained in careful words that Kale had pushed his body far beyond what should have been possible. "Your blood oxygen level when we found you was at 40% of normal," the doctor said with something like wonder in their voice. "Most species would be unconscious at 60% and dead at 50%, but you were still moving, still functioning, still making decisions that saved lives." Kale shrugged with the shoulder that hurt less. "On Mars we train for this. Dome breaches happen all the time. You learn to function on thin air or you do not survive your first year." The doctor stared at him for a long moment before shaking their head slowly. "Humans are remarkable creatures." What Kale did not know, what no one had told him yet, was that he had become the most famous person in the sector overnight. The security drone footage had spread across the galaxy like wildfire. News networks on hundreds of worlds had played it on continuous loop, commentators breaking down every moment of his impossible journey through the burning station. Military academies were already studying his decision-making process, his ability to remain calm under pressure, his leadership in a crisis situation. Politicians were giving speeches about interspecies cooperation and the contributions of humanity to galactic civilization. And on social media platforms spanning dozens of star systems, his name was trending above everything else. Kale Vance of New Olympus. The Dust Boy. The human who walked through fire. When a nurse finally showed him the footage on a datapad, Kale watched in silence with an expression that revealed nothing. He saw himself carrying the injured Althian boy through flames that seemed impossible to survive. He saw himself pulling the metal beam from the wall with a strength that should have been beyond him. He saw himself collapse at the end, his body finally surrendering, and he felt strangely distant from the boy on the screen. That boy seemed like someone else, someone stronger and braver than Kale felt himself to be. "There are people waiting to see you," the nurse said gently. "Important people from many different worlds, but they will wait until you are ready. There is no rush." Kale nodded but said nothing, his mind still processing everything that had happened. That evening, as the artificial lights dimmed to simulate nightfall, there was a soft knock at his door. Kale looked up expecting another doctor or nurse, but instead saw Lyrie Velshin standing in the doorway, her luminous skin pale and her silver eyes uncertain in a way he had never seen before. She looked smaller somehow, diminished, like something had been stripped away from her that she had always taken for granted. "May I come in?" she asked, and her voice was quiet and hesitant, nothing like the confident cruelty she had wielded in the classroom. Kale nodded, and she entered slowly, stopping several feet from his bed as if afraid to come any closer. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Lyrie took a breath and began. "I have spent my entire life believing certain things," she said, her words careful and measured. "I was taught that the Althian people were the pinnacle of evolution, that our telepathy and our culture and our history made us superior to younger races like humanity. I believed that without question because everyone around me believed it too." She paused and her hands clasped together in front of her, fingers twisting nervously. "When I saw you in that classroom, I saw everything I had been taught to despise. A human from a colony world, poor and rough, and coming from a place of struggle and suffering. And I treated you the way I was taught to treat such people, with contempt and mockery and casual cruelty." Kale watched her without expression, waiting. "And then the alarms went off," Lyrie continued, "and everything I thought I knew about strength and superiority crumbled to dust. I collapsed because I could not handle the fear around me. My people have never faced real crisis. We have never needed to survive the way your people have. And when true danger came, I was useless, worse than useless." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "But you did not collapse. You did not panic. You did not even hesitate. You simply began saving lives with a competence and calm that I could not understand. And when you helped me through my panic attack, you were kind to me, even though I had been nothing but cruel to you." Lyrie met his eyes directly now, and there were tears forming in her silver gaze. "I touched your mind when you were leading us through the fire," she admitted quietly. "I felt what you felt. I saw who you truly are beneath the surface, and what I found there shamed me more deeply than anything in my life." "What did you find?" Cale asked, his first words since she entered. "Compassion," Lyrie said. "You were saving people who had mocked you, who had hurt you, who had treated you like nothing. And you were doing it without anger or resentment or any thought of making us pay for our cruelty. You were doing it because that is simply who you are. Because when humans see people in danger, they help them, even their enemies, even those who do not deserve it." She stepped closer to the bed, her tears falling freely now. "I called your people primitive," she said. "I called your history shameful. I treated your struggles as something to mock rather than something to admire, and I was wrong. I was so terribly wrong about everything." Cale looked at her for a long moment, this beautiful privileged girl who had never known hardship until the universe forced it upon her. He could have been cold, could have told her that her apology changed nothing, could have made her feel the weight of her cruelty. But that was not who he was. "We are survivors," Cale said simply. "My people came from a world that tried to kill us every day. And when that was not enough, we went to Mars, where the world tried even harder. We lost so many along the way, my mother among them, but we kept going because that is what we do." He shifted in his bed to face her more directly. "You were cruel because you were taught to be cruel, because you never knew any other way, but now you do know. And what you do with that knowledge is up to you. You can let this change you, or you can go back to who you were before. That is your choice." Lyrie wiped her eyes with trembling hands. "How can you be so forgiving?" she asked. "After everything I said to you, after how I treated you, how can you not hate me?" Cale thought about it for a moment before answering. "Hate takes energy," he said. "And energy is too precious to waste on things that do not help you survive. My mother taught me that. She taught me that every breath is a gift and every moment is a choice. You can choose to carry anger and bitterness, or you can choose to let it go and focus on what matters." He met her silver eyes with his own. "You are not my enemy, Lyrie. You were just someone who did not understand. Now you understand. That is enough for me." Lyrie stood there for a long time, processing his words. Then she did something that surprised them both. She bowed, a deep formal bow that the Althian people reserved for those they considered worthy of the highest respect. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving my life and for showing me what I was too blind to see." Then she turned and left, and Cale was alone again with his thoughts and the soft humming of the healing machines. But something had shifted in the galaxy that day. Something that could never be undone. The Great Hall of the Galactic Unity Council was the largest enclosed space Cale had ever seen, a vast dome of crystal and light that could hold 100,000 beings from every corner of known space. Today it held exactly that many, packed into seats that rose in endless tiers toward a ceiling painted with the stars of 1,000 worlds. And every single one of them was looking at Cale. He stood backstage in clothes that felt strange and new, a formal suit that someone had tailored specifically for him, and his hands kept wanting to tug at the collar even though he had been told repeatedly that it fit perfectly. The bandages were gone from his hands now, the healing technology of the Central Worlds far more advanced than anything on Mars. But he could still feel the ghost of those burns when he flexed his fingers. A functionary with too many eyes and a nervous manner appeared at his elbow and began reciting the protocol for the ceremony, the proper way to walk and stand and bow and accept the medal. But Kale was barely listening. He was thinking about his mother. She would have been terrified and proud in equal measure to see him here, her boy from the dust standing before the leaders of the galaxy. She had always believed he was meant for something greater than the mines, had sacrificed everything to give him a chance at education, at a life beyond the red dust and thin air of their harsh world. And now here he was, about to receive the Galactic Unity Medal, the highest civilian honor in all of known space, given only 3 times in the past century. The functionary finished his recitation and gave Kale a worried look. "Are you ready?" he asked. Kale nodded because there was nothing else to do, and then the great doors opened and he walked out into the light. The applause that greeted him was like a physical wave, a wall of sound that washed over him and made his steps falter for just a moment. He recovered and continued forward, walking the long path to the central stage, where the leaders of a dozen major species waited to honor him. He saw the Althian High Counselor, a being of ancient dignity who watched him with eyes that held no more contempt. He saw the human ambassador, a woman from Earth who was weeping openly with pride. He saw representatives from species he could not even name, all of them standing in respect for a teenage boy from a mining colony who had done nothing more than what his people had always done: survive and help others survive. The ceremony was long and filled with formal words that Kale did not really hear. The medal was placed around his neck, a heavy disc of precious metals inscribed with symbols from every founding species of the galactic unity. And then came the moment he had been dreading, the moment when they asked him to speak. Kale approached the podium on legs that felt unsteady for the first time since the disaster, and looked out at the vast sea of faces watching him expectantly. He had not prepared a speech because he did not know what to say to these people who saw him as a hero when he had only done what anyone from Mars would have done. But as he stood there in the silence, words began to form on their own. "I am not good at speeches," Kale began, his voice rough and honest. "On Mars we do not waste words because wasting anything can get you killed, so I will try to keep this simple." He gripped the edges of the podium to steady himself. "You have called me a hero, but I do not feel like one. I feel like a boy who did what he was taught to do by people who knew that survival is not a gift, but a choice you make every single day." He paused and thought of his mother, of her hand going cold in his, while the rescue teams dug through the rubble. "My mother died in a mine collapse when I was 12 years old. She held my hand and told me stories to keep me calm while the oxygen ran out around us. And when the rescue teams finally reached us, she was gone, but I was still breathing because she had given me her own air, her own life, so that I might live." The hall had gone completely silent. "That is what humans do," Kale continued. "We give everything we have so that others might survive. We walk into fire because someone on the other side needs help. We carry the wounded even when our own bodies are breaking because we cannot bear to leave anyone behind." He looked out at the Althian delegation and saw Lyri sitting among them, her silver eyes fixed on him with an intensity that burned. "Some of you have called my people primitive. You have looked at our history of war and struggle and suffering, and you have seen weakness. You have mocked our desperate expansion across our solar system, our tin cans and recycled air and constant fight against death, and I understand why you see it that way." He straightened his shoulders. "But what I see when I look at human history is something different. I see a species that refused to accept extinction, that buried its dead and built on their graves, that looked up at stars that were impossibly far away and said we will find a way to reach them. I see a species that evolved on a world of predators and poison and natural disasters, a death world by any galactic standard, and instead of being destroyed by it, we were forged by it. We became something that does not know how to give up, that does not understand the concept of impossible. He thought of the corridor filled with fire, of the children following him through the smoke, of the moment when his body should have failed but did not. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy. We are not the oldest or the wisest or the most advanced, but we are relentless. We are stubborn beyond all reason, and we take care of our own. He paused and let his gaze sweep across the vast hall. Even the ones who have not learned to be kind yet. He saw Lyrie flinch slightly at those words, saw the understanding in her eyes, and saw something else there too, something like determination. The students I saved in that station were not my friends. Some of them had mocked me just hours before the disaster struck, but that did not matter when the fire came. What mattered was that they needed help and I could give it. That is the legacy my mother left me. That is what every human learns in the cradle. You help those who need helping regardless of whether they deserve it. You fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. You carry the weight because someone has to. He touched the medal hanging around his neck. I accept this honor not for myself, but for my mother who died giving me life. For every human who scratched out survival on hostile worlds so their children could reach for something better. For everyone who ever walked into danger because someone on the other side needed them. He stepped back from the podium. We are the dust people, born of hardship and forged in fire, and we are not going anywhere. The applause that followed was different from before, deeper and more profound. A recognition not just of what he had done, but of who he was and who his people were. And as Cale walked back through the cheering crowd, he felt his mother's presence beside him, warm and proud and finally at peace. In the years that followed, Cale Vance became the youngest admiral in the history of the Joint Galactic Fleet, a leader known for his calm under pressure and his absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. Lyrie Velshon served as his communications officer, a position she had requested specifically, and in time they became friends who understood each other in ways few others could. And in classrooms across the galaxy, when instructors taught about humanity, they no longer spoke of primitive struggles and desperate survival. They spoke of endurance and compassion, and the unbreakable will of a species that had crawled out of the mud and reached for the stars. They spoke of the dust boy who walked through fire. They spoke of what it truly meant to be human. And somewhere in the eternal dark between the stars, the spirit of a mother who had given everything for her son smiled with pride that would last forever. Because her boy had not just survived. He had shown the entire galaxy the meaning of hope.